Now, the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Geraghty.
And welcome, everyone, to the Thursday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. Along with Jim Geraghty of National Review, I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. We have good, crazy, and crazy martinis for conservatives today, two of them involving specific U.S. Senate races in the 2018 midterm. So, Jim, let's jump right to the good martini, and we go to Missouri. We've talked about this race already this year, where Missouri Attorney General Josh Hawley looks to be in pretty strong position against incumbent Democratic Senator Claire McCaskill. New polling shows that Josh Hawley has apparently weathered the ugliness of the Eric Greitens situation and is now back in the lead. Attorney General Josh Hawley leads incumbent Democratic U.S. Senator Claire McCaskill in this year's race for the U.S. Senate, according to new polling. A new survey conducted by the Remington Research Group on behalf of the Missouri Times shows that of 1,034 surveyed voters, 50% approve of President Donald Trump, while also showing that the Republican Attorney General may have a slight competitive edge over the incumbent Democrat. Then we go straight to the questions. Who do you want, Hawley or McCaskill? It's close, but it's Hawley 48% and McCaskill 46% with 6% undecided. Closer than we would like, but McCaskill's under 50, and that's always a good sign. The fact that it's this close and there's a +6 in favorability for Donald Trump might have Hawley a little bit concerned. The other thing that's going to be complicating this race, Jim, is that there's an important ballot initiative. Proposition A is what it's called, and it's about right to work. Do you want to establish right to work in Missouri? Something we would love, but right now it's trailing in the polls 56-38. So that might be one of the reasons that the Senate race is a little tight, too. So what do you make of the fact that an incumbent seems to be on the ropes here in Missouri?
Yeah, this is good news for Hawley on more than one level. Worth noting, you go over to Real Clear Politics. This is the first poll out of the last 6 that has shown Hawley ahead. There was one Missouri Scout poll that put McCaskill up 4. One had a tie, and then the other two, Mason-Dixon and Gravis, had her up by 1 or 2. Look, it's going to be a close race. No one should be expecting a huge victory in this. What made that little swoon through a chunk of the spring concerning is that a good chunk of the polling that had gone on before by the Republican firm Remington Research had Hawley up consistently. So it's kind of nice to see another poll showing Hawley up. Also, as you mentioned, when you see a state adopt a right to work, obviously there's been a big priority of the Koch network. Lots of Republicans have liked it. It's the sort of thing that tends to, if you give people the option of not being a member of a union, quite a few workers will choose that because they simply don't feel like they're getting their money's worth for their dues. So when you see a state adopt that, Missouri adopted it, I'm going to say either early last year, not that long ago. Generally, it means there's been a shift in public opinion in the state, and the polling for this referendum they're going to have on it looks pretty darn bad. Really kind of surprising. Now, you could argue maybe the wording of the ballot language isn't as clear as it ought to be. The yeses are at 38, the nos are at 56, and that's kind of a unnerving development. It kind of suggests that this legislative victory for the right could be undermined. And it's the sort of thing which you figure for labor unions, this is about as big a turnout driver and motivator as you're going to find. So seeing Hawley up even just a little bit is somewhat reassuring. We all know that between now and November, there's very likely to be a confirmation vote in the U.S. Senate on Brett Kavanaugh. If I had to guess today, I'm going to guess that Claire McCaskill will vote no. She voted no on Neil Gorsuch, and I suspect this will make Republicans in the Senate even more fired up, unless Kavanaugh has some terrible mistake in the confirmation hearing or some sort of serious scandal in his background. And I don't mean, he spent a lot on baseball tickets and put it on his credit card and then paid it off. I mean, a real scandal, Democrats. That might hurt her numbers some. And I think just generally, this is one of those things where the Republicans go into this race thinking that their chances are no worse than 50-50 when you've got an incumbent who's polling fairly consistently in the mid to upper 40s, lower than where an incumbent senator wants to be.
All right, let's head south to the state of Texas, where Ted Cruz is running for a second term, and his opponent, of course, is Democratic Congressman Beto O'Rourke. And the left is very, very excited about the money that O'Rourke is raising. This is from the Dallas Morning News. Democrat Beto O'Rourke raised an eye-popping $10.4 million in the last 3 months, catching up to Ted Cruz's 6-year haul in just over 15 months as he seeks to topple the darling of Texas Republicans. The El Paso congressman's ability to vastly outpace the incumbent is no longer in doubt. Cruz collected $4.6 million during the same period, and O'Rourke has extended his streak of raising more than the incumbent in one of the nation's costliest races. The latest 3-month haul leaves O'Rourke with $14 million for the last 4 months before Election Day. His fundraising total is now about $23.7 million. That's almost exactly the sum Cruz has raised for his Senate campaign account since winning the seat back in 2012. But those are rounded numbers. Bragging rights will have to wait until the campaigns file their quarterly reports, which aren't due till Sunday. Just before midnight on Wednesday, Cruz announced that he raised about $4.5 million from March to the end of June, bringing his total to $23.7 million, too, with $10.4 million in the bank. So, Jim, there's bragging rights on fundraising, and then there's bragging rights on Election Day. And if you go to the Real Clear Politics average, Cruz is up by 8.4%. And in the most recent polls, he seems to be outside the margin of error. So Beto O'Rourke can raise all the money he wants from Democratic donors. Right now, it doesn't look like it's going to matter much.
Greg, if you're in charge of the Senate Democrats, you have to wonder if that $20-some million, and by the end of this race, maybe it'll be $30 million, going to Beto O'Rourke is really the best place it could be spent, or whether you'd rather have that in a place like Florida for Bill Nelson or Indiana for Joe Donnelly. One of the other great ironies is that a bunch of the red state races that are up this year with incumbent Democrats are fairly cheap states to run campaigns. $1 million in TV advertising will go a lot further in a place like West Virginia than it will in a big state with a lot of media markets like Texas. I suppose Democrats can cheer this news. I suppose you could say it's bad news that he's for Ted Cruz that he's going to have such a well-funded opponent. On the other hand, this is a state that has not elected a Democrat statewide since 1994, and those of us with memories will remember, magazine covers touting an obscure state legislator in pink sneakers last time, and how Julian Castro and was the next rising star for Texas Democrats. And, is Beto O'Rourke probably going to do better than Texas Democrats did in 2014? Yes, because they did terrible that year, even by the standards of recent history. That this was a just a shellacking up and down the ballot in just about every statewide race. The other problem is, though, that doing better than usual is probably not going to be enough to get it done in this state. I know Democrats hate Ted Cruz. I know that every time they hear his voice, it just drives them crazy. And they probably, I'm sure there are lots of angry liberals like, oh, we're going to beat Ted Cruz. You're probably not, Democrats. Look, Beto O'Rourke has got a nice resume and, on paper, all that kind of stuff. But it says something that every other prominent rising star Texas Democrat chose not to run against this. The Gravis poll has Ted Cruz up by 9. The CBS News poll has Cruz up by 10. This is not great poll. It's good polling for a Texas Democrat, but you're not putting you close to victory. And you got to wonder how much do you want to invest in this race compared to all the other ones. So as far as Republicans are concerned, throw that money at the longest long shot races as possible. Spend as much money in Texas. We want to make sure your red state incumbents who are trouble in other places are running out of money. I'm sure Beto O'Rourke can have gold-plated campaign offices and all the money in the world. In the end, Texas is a very Republican state, and this may look like a giant waste of money by Democrats on Election Day 2018.
I'm sure our liberal listeners are saying, oh, I'm taping this one. I'm going to play it back when they say that Beto doesn't have a chance. Well, okay, go ahead.
Look, it's worth noting that there was this giant effort by progressive groups and former Obama campaign officials at Battleground Texas in 2014. And they were putting unbelievable efforts into voter registration and unbelievable efforts into get out the they had all the bells and whistles and all the money they wanted in 2014, and it didn't work out very well. Now, again, having your top candidate run on the issue of abortion in Texas probably doesn't help. The last-minute attempt to go after Greg Abbott and kind of imply, kind of attack him for being a paraplegic didn't play well. 2014 was just a terrible, terrible year for Democrats in Texas. And maybe, again, I don't dispute they'll do better than last time. That's a really low bar to clear. And I've heard all these boasting about great turnout and great money and all that kind of stuff for a long time. One of these years, Texas Democrats will win a statewide race in Texas. I just don't think this is the year. And I'm tired of hearing it every 2 years that, the Texas Democrats have discovered the next, great white hope.
All right, let's move on to our second crazy martini now. And Jim, I'm sure you've heard in a couple different places over the past several days, and really ever since Anthony Kennedy announced he was leaving the Supreme Court, that whoever President Trump picks, and now especially that we know that it's Brett Kavanaugh, well, women's rights are being rolled back decades, if not centuries. Civil rights. We're all going to lose health care. I mean, it's the biggest demonization project you've seen, well, probably since Neil Gorsuch. But now we're taking it to another level. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, probably trying to build up his liberal bona fides, says that he's willing to challenge the U.S. Supreme Court if it ever strikes down Roe v. Wade. He says, quote, he'll sue the Supreme Court if it rolls back Roe v. Wade. Governor Cuomo has been calling on lawmakers to increase protections in New York. Quote, we never passed the New York state law because we relied on Roe v. Wade and everyone assumed it would always be there. So this guy was Attorney General of the state of New York at one point, Jim. I'm pretty sure he knows that there's no other place to challenge a Supreme Court decision. So he's now looking at state laws, which, oh, by the way, is kind of what the Federalist approach, the conservative approach to this has been all along.
You know, I'm going to quote a really good line from Derek Hunter yesterday, who, upon hearing this bizarre just almost nonsensical statement from Andrew Cuomo yesterday. He said, look, I realize we're all excited about this, but let's remember the race for dumbest Cuomo is a marathon, not a sprint. Chris Cuomo looking pretty sharp these days. So here's the thing. I think in all likelihood, Andrew Cuomo knows there's no one to sue over a Supreme Court decision. There is no Judge Dredd. There is no Wapner, Judge Judy. There's no, oh, yeah, well, we're going to go to, there's no one else there. You can't appeal it to the United Nations, the Federation of Planets. There is no bigger, higher authority that can overrule the Supreme Court. My suspicion is that he knows this sounds tough in a New York State Democratic primary. It makes it, I'm really fighting against the Trump administration. I'm going to, I'll pull out all the stops. I won't quit. And, the more you and I, discuss politics every day, if you're listening to this podcast, I think you're probably a pretty smart person and you have exceptional taste. No, you chances are you follow politics. You get what we're talking about. And you probably have at least a passing familiarity with the Constitution, how the U.S. government is set up, what the laws are, how you change a law. And the sad thing is that there are a lot of Americans who don't. A lot of Americans who, many people point out, can't name a single Supreme Court justice, can't name the three branches of government, can't say how many senators there are, how many members of the House, all the basics that you get in grade school, in elementary school. My sons already know this stuff. And I'd like to think it's not just because they hang around me and I rant about these things at the dinner table. People need to know this stuff so that when Andrew Cuomo makes an implausible, I'm going to say threat or pledge or promise, that more people don't say, Governor, what the hell are you talking about? There's no who are you going to sue? Brett Kavanaugh? Like, how is suing someone going to change a Supreme Court decision? And Cuomo can get away with this. One, because a chunk of the public doesn't know any better. Not all, but it's enough of them who vote in a Democratic primary that he feels comfortable he can get away with it. And the second thing is, I haven't seen the New York Times today, but I'm pretty sure the headline in the print edition was not, Andrew Cuomo does not understand how the Supreme Court works. If it was, well, one, we'd say, hey, good for you, New York Times. Give a little feather in the hat. Not quite as much liberal bias as we think there are. And, of course, Cynthia Nixon would be dancing a jig. But they don't do that, right? If any, maybe there'll be an op-ed on this. Wouldn't really count on it. Maybe it'll get mentioned in their coverage of the statewide race. But in all likelihood, people will just kind of shake their head and shrug it off and say, oh, there goes Cuomo making a promise that doesn't even make any constitutional sense. There's no consequence for Andrew Cuomo for making an implausible or impossible promise like this. And that's what I think the problem is. It's a lost cause to expect that the New York Times would ever, wake up one day and say, Governor of New York, law school graduate, has no understanding of America's legal system. Remove him from office immediately because he's just too ignorant to continue. You're not going to see that any day. Educate the public in the basics of this stuff so they can't make these kinds of crazy promises and things like that. It's a long, difficult slog, but I think it's just rather revealing that maybe you'll see factcheck.org or one of these organizations put out a statement saying, well, actually, you can't sue the Supreme Court if they reach a ruling or a decision that you don't like. But there is no consequence to being a shameless liar or saying things that can't happen in our politics anymore. And I think the country is well ill-served by this. But we, as much as we might fume about the politicians and fume about the media, if we want there to be consequences to making, asinine statements like this, we have to enforce consequences. And at this point, I'll be interested to see what happens. But I don't think New York Democratic primary voters are going to do it. And I don't think that the electorate as a whole is going to enforce any consequences, Greg.
Yes, great writing also by Allah Pundit over at Hot Air, who says that this is really just, like you said a moment ago, an effort to protect his liberal base. He says he's basically afraid that Cynthia Nixon's going to turn into the next Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And so he says he's making whatever beast-like grunts and whistles he feels he needs to in order to protect his left flank. Next week, he'll be threatening to challenge Kavanaugh to a duel. This is where the left is right now, Jim. It's kind of fun, but if they're ever actually in a position of power, which they will be at some point, it won't be as funny then.
I was going to say, Greg, if we're talking about duels up in New York, wouldn't Pence be the more likely target? Cue the musical number.
Oh, Hamilton. He finally won in New York. Have a good day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow, Greg.
Jim Geraghty of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks for being with us today, and be sure to tune in again on Friday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.